The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, was formed to defend Western Europe from Soviet forces that remained in Eastern Europe after World War II. In response, the Soviets formed an alliance of Eastern Bloc nations in 1955 with the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance that became known as the Warsaw Pact. General Dwight Eisenhower was the first NATO Supreme Allied Commander and explained its original purpose.
For many months, the nations of NATO have been engaged in building for themselves a wall of security. They have no aggressive intent or purpose of their own. They desire only to live in peace behind the defenses that they themselves collectively build to protect their own freedoms, which they themselves have earned. Today, another significant step was taken in this process of building a wall of security. Officially and formally, SHAPE headquarters was opened. Its mission is to take charge of all forces allocated by NATO nations to the business of establishing a collective defense for the freedom, peace, and security of Western Europe.
After assuming that post in 1951, General Eisenhower wrote about NATO's goal, quote, "If in 10 years all American troops stationed in Europe for national defense purposes have not been returned to the United States, then this whole project will have failed." It did fail because 7 decades later, long after the Soviet Union dissolved, NATO still exists with thousands of American troops deployed throughout Europe. The Warsaw Pact was disbanded in 1991 as Soviet troops withdrew from Eastern Europe. NATO did not disband, but expanded and constructed a massive new headquarters in Belgium, pictured. The United States retained its huge military bases in Europe, while Russian forces shrank dramatically and pulled back home. The American Empire exploited this peace to expand NATO to absorb former Warsaw Pact nations and even former Soviet republics, while deploying NATO forces to Russia's borders. American forces now conduct military exercises near Russia's borders. European NATO, without the United States and Canada, doesn't need American combat forces in Europe since it has 4 times the population of Russia, with an economy 10 times larger. Russia's GDP is the same as Spain's. Nevertheless, the United States devoted several $billion in extra military spending to build new military bases in Eastern Europe. The biggest provocation occurred when President Obama authorized the building of 2 large missile bases in Poland and Romania. American generals claim these are anti-missile systems to defend Europe from an Iranian nuclear attack. However, Iran has no nuclear weapons and no serious plans to build any. It has no missiles that can reach Europe. Moreover, there is no reason Iran would fire missiles at Europe. The United States claims it has SM-3 anti-ballistic missiles at these bases, but these lack the range to serve as regional missile defense systems. See the article linked below. However, they use the same Mk-41 launcher used to launch American cruise missiles, and the United States is developing nuclear weapons for cruise missiles. This will allow the United States to launch a surprise nuclear attack on Russia. These 2 missile bases cost the United States over $2 billion to construct and serve no purpose other than to threaten Russia. American generals insist everyone must trust them, even though it is impossible to verify what type of missiles are in these Mk-41 launchers. The governments of Poland and Romania are unaware, nor are 99% of the American servicemen at these bases. Even if the type of missile in these launchers is independently verified, they can be swapped for nuclear-armed cruise missiles in a matter of hours. The famous trust but verify policy from the Cold War has been discarded. This could lead to another Cuban Missile Crisis should Russia build anti-missile bases in Cuba. Western leaders had promised the Russians that NATO expansion would never happen. President George H.W. Bush had assured Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev during the Malta summit in December 1989 that the United States would not take advantage of the newly freed nations in Eastern Europe to threaten Soviet interests. There were suggestions that American troops would withdraw from West Germany as the Soviets withdrew from East Germany. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's famous "not 1 inch eastward" assurance about NATO in his meeting with Gorbachev on February 9, 1990, was part of a cascade of assurances given by Western leaders to Soviet officials, according to declassified documents posted at the National Security Archive. Link below. Proponents of NATO expansion argue that none of this matters, since nothing was signed. They ignore the founding act that NATO and Russia signed in 1997 to guide relations by trust and cooperation. The entire agreement is linked below, but part states, quote, NATO reiterates that in the current and foreseeable security environment, the alliance will carry out its collective defense and other missions by ensuring the necessary interoperability, integration, and capability for reinforcement, rather than by additional permanent stationing of substantial combat forces. NATO claims its new bases in Eastern Europe don't have substantial combat forces, yet look at all its new bases in Poland, where the U.S. Army is placing an entire armored brigade. Building several new military bases near Russia's borders to house American and German troops was provocative and disrupted the post-Cold War era of peace. This is used to justify increased military spending and new nuclear weaponry. Yet the American empire blames Russia for tensions, as State Department spokesman Admiral John Kirby did in 2014.
He also used that phrase, that its army, meaning Russia's army, on NATO's doorstep. Why is that? Is it not logical to look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding? That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO? Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
Okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for...
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to, moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern
I'm
cities.
pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
It's not
Okay.
changed, but I'm
So,
pretty sure the movement by Russia is Russia's decision.
if NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved, not
NATO
because
is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
for 50 years it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So
Where's
do you
the
not
Soviet
understand
Union
it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians will perceive it as a threat? And the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border, while their troops, I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida. What I can tell you is that NATO is a defensive alliance. It remains a defensive alliance.
Fair enough, but it has moved east, correct? I mean, that's just a fact.
It has expanded, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
But
And
there's
so the
no reason
reason
for anybody to think the expansion is a hostile or threatening move. And we've been saying that throughout the last 15 years,
It's
Matt.
like you're moving closer to Russia, yet you're blaming the Russians for being close to NATO.
No.
That's